On a freezing January morning in Baltimore, a luxury helicopter roared down over a row of aging brick homes. Inside her tiny kitchen, Grace Miller, once a line cook wrongly branded a thief, looked up from her cup of instant coffee. She hadn't seen Jordan and Ava in 18 years, but they remembered the woman who fed them in secret when they were starving behind the restaurant. And now, they had come back. Not with a thank you note, but with the power to change her life forever. If this story touches your heart, please consider subscribing. Your one click means the world to our small channel and helps us bring more stories of hope, kindness, and second chances to life. On a freezing January morning in Baltimore, a luxury helicopter roared down over a row of aging brick homes. Inside her tiny kitchen, Grace Miller, once a line cook wrongly branded a thief, looked up from her cup of instant coffee. She hadn't seen Jordan and Ava in 18 years, but they remembered the woman who fed them in secret when they were starving behind the restaurant. And now they had come back, not with a thank you note, but with the power to change her life forever. Baltimore had never looked more colorless than it did that morning. The sky hung low and gray, thick with cold that crept through walls and bones. On the east side of town, nestled among worn row houses with chipped paint and crooked mailboxes, stood Grace Miller's modest home, a square of warmth built on borrowed hope and quiet endurance. Grace stood barefoot on the linoleum kitchen floor, steam curling from the chipped mug in her hand. Her joints ached, not just from age, but from years of work that never quite paid off. 45 now, she lived alone. The radio murmured softly in the background. Old jazz. She liked Coltrane on gray days. He reminded her of the kind of sorrow that made room for dignity. Then it happened. A low thrum. Then louder, louder. The whole kitchen trembled. Her mug rattled against the counter. She pressed her hand to the windowsill and squinted through the frost-bitten glass. A helicopter. Not just any helicopter, a gleaming black and silver corporate chopper with gold-tipped rotor blades. Its descent sent trash and snow skimming across the cracked pavement outside. "What in God's name?" she whispered, already tying her robe tighter. The neighbors emerged one by one. An old man in a sweat-stained beanie, a mother holding her toddler up to the window. Baltimore wasn't unfamiliar with noise, but helicopters didn't land on this block. Not without sirens, not without trouble. But this wasn't trouble. The chopper landed with precision, barely a meter from her front gate. The blades slowed, the door swung open, and from it stepped a man in a tailored gray overcoat, face partially hidden behind sunglasses, hair neat beneath the wind. Behind him, a woman followed, tall, poised, in a midnight blue pantsuit, her expression unreadable. Grace's hand fell to her side. The man took off his sunglasses. His eyes searched the house, his lips parted as if to speak. Then came the voice that cracked the shell of time wide open. "Do you remember us, Miss Grace?" Her breath caught. Jordan and Ava. She staggered back a step, clutching the edge of the table for balance. Her mind scrambled for something rational. The last time she'd seen them, Jordan was barely 10, thin as bone and fierce in silence. Ava had clung to his sleeve like it was the last piece of her world. Now they stood like pillars before her, accomplished, confident, and real. They came back. Jordan smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "We didn't want to call. We wanted you to see." Ava took a step forward. "You told us once that a real home doesn't need a doorbell. You said love always knows where to find its way back." Grace opened the door. Not all the way, just enough for her heart to peer through. "You remembered that?" "We remembered everything," Her knees nearly gave. They reached for her just in time, Jordan steadying her arm, Ava guiding her inside. For a long time, no one said a word. They sat in the old kitchen that smelled faintly of cinnamon and memory, while the helicopter waited quietly at the curb like a loyal witness to destiny. "You shouldn't be here," Grace whispered. "Not in this part of town. Not after what you've become." Jordan shook his head. "We're here because of what you became." Ava placed something on the table. A photo. It was the three of them, long ago, taken on a disposable camera. Grace, hair tied back in a faded bandana. Jordan and Ava, thinner than they should have been, but smiling with spaghetti sauce on their cheeks. Behind them, the back alley behind Delphine's kitchen. "We used to call you our guardian ghost," Ava said softly. "Food would appear like magic. Warm blankets, notes with drawings, but we always knew it was you." "You could have gotten in trouble," Jordan added. "You did get in trouble." Grace looked down, her eyes wet but unwavering. "Some things are worth it." Outside, the wind howled, but in the kitchen, something warmer rose. Memory, reunion, and something unspoken that had survived 18 winters. "We have something to show you," Jordan said at last. "Come with us." She blinked. "Now?" Ava smiled. "You've waited long enough." Grace hesitated, then nodded slowly. She slipped into her old coat, the one she wore that last night before everything shattered. The walk to the helicopter felt like a dream stretched across time. Neighbors whispered. A child clapped. The old man with the beanie tipped his head in awe. The chopper door closed behind them with a gentle thud. As they rose into the gray Baltimore sky, Grace saw her street become smaller, her house like a toy. But her past, her choices, loomed larger than ever. And beside her sat two children who were no longer children, who had carried her kindness like a seed until it bloomed. She didn't know yet where they were taking her. But for the first time in 18 years, Grace Miller no longer felt forgotten. She felt found. The first time Grace Miller saw the children, they were nothing more than shadows, half hidden behind stacks of flour sacks and crates of canned tomatoes in the rear pantry of Delphine. It was late December in Baltimore, the kind of cold that could split your fingers if you worked too long near the back door. Delphine wasn't just any restaurant. It was a crown jewel of Inner Harbor. Politicians dined there, athletes, men in cashmere scarves with sharp wives and sharper tongues. Grace had worked there 5 years, not as a chef. Delphine had no black chefs, but as a line cook, stationed at the back, chopping onions and washing blood off cuts of meat, her face always slick with heat and steam. She had learned to move silently. In the kitchen, silence was currency, especially under Charles Whitmore, head chef, culinary genius, and self-proclaimed king of the backline. He didn't tolerate noise, or opinions, or kindness. His knives were always clean, and his punishments even cleaner. That night, the first week of Christmas rush, the kitchen buzzed with tension. Orders flew like bullets. The sous chef barked numbers. The air smelled of seared duck and burnt shallots. Grace worked her station, eyes low, fingers numb, until she heard it. Just a shuffle. Barely a breath. A soft scraping, like cloth on metal. She glanced toward the pantry. 2 sets of eyes stared back. A boy, maybe 10. Brown skin, sharp cheekbones, no coat. Standing in front of a girl, maybe 7, shivering under his arm. He didn't speak, didn't blink, just stared. Grace's heart lurched. She scanned the room. No one else noticed. All eyes were on service. She walked slowly to the pantry, keeping her hands low, her voice even. "Don't run," she whispered. The girl whimpered. The boy raised his chin. Grace crouched, gently pulled out a packet of brioche and a small wedge of cheese she had tucked in her apron, meant for her own dinner break. She slid it across the floor. They didn't move at first. Then the boy stepped forward, cautious, and took the food. He didn't say thank you, but his eyes lingered, just long enough. That was how it began. The next night, they returned. This time, she was ready. A paper plate behind the trash bin, warm cornbread, a boiled egg, 2 slices of roasted chicken. She never saw them eat, but every plate came back empty, and a small note was left in return, drawn in crayon on napkins. The first was a crooked smiley face. The second, a tiny sketch of a pot with steam coming out of it. The third, a heart. Grace kept them in her locker, folded carefully. She never told anyone. But kindness in a place like Delphine was dangerous. Charles Whitmore noticed everything. If a steak was half a second overdone, if a sprig of rosemary wasn't curled right on the plate, he'd unleash hell. Grace knew how to stay invisible. She had learned that long before Delphine, long before kitchens. But what she couldn't hide was the slight increase in food used. A second roll gone, a half breast unaccounted for. One night, the pantry door was ajar. The kids didn't come. Instead, a camera blinked from the top corner, new and red-lit. Grace's stomach dropped. She went home that night in silence, her coat soaked with kitchen sweat and shame. She didn't sleep. Just lay on her narrow mattress, staring at the ceiling, thinking of the little girl's fingers trembling over cheese. She still didn't know their names. The next evening, she cooked the extra meal anyway. She placed it behind the spice rack at exactly 8:15. But the children never came. And when she turned around, Charles Whitmore stood behind her. Not yelling, not red-faced, smiling. A terrible smile. "Generosity," he said coldly, "is not a spice we use here, Grace." She tried to explain, just a leftover roll, just one child. But he raised a hand. "You're done." No warning, no hearing, just silence. The next morning, her name was scrubbed from the shift list. Her last paycheck was light, and by Monday, the story had spread across 3 kitchens in Baltimore. Grace Miller steals food from the restaurant. She applied to every kitchen she could find. Diners, buffets, food trucks. No one called back. At the Baltimore Grill, the manager handed her resume back without reading it. "I heard about Delphine," he said softly. "That's a hard smell to wash off." Grace spent her days caring for her mother, Mabel Miller, frail and fading from stage 4 kidney failure. She spent her nights delivering newspapers or cleaning hallways, anything to keep the lights on. And sometimes, when no one was watching, she left small bags of food under the bench at Patterson Park, just in case. Sometimes the food was gone by morning. Sometimes it wasn't. But she still left it. Because what else could she do? Then one evening, while the sky bled orange over the row houses, she returned to the park and found the bench bare. Not just of food, but of everything. No wrappers, no signs, no crayon drawings, only a note tucked under the bench plank. A single sentence, written in uneven, childlike print. "They said we can't come back." Grace read it 5 times. Then she sat down, her hands shaking, the cold seeping into her knees through the thin fabric of her pants. The park grew darker, and for the first time in years, Grace cried. Not because she'd lost a job, but because she'd lost 2 ghosts she never got to save. She walked home slowly that night, the letter crumpled in her palm. Somewhere in the city, 2 children were being taken, maybe to a shelter, maybe to a place worse. Somewhere, someone would ask them questions, names, parents, histories, and they would have nothing to say, only memory. Only the smell of warm brioche and the sound of a soft voice saying, "Don't run." Back in her apartment, she sat at the kitchen table and laid out the crayon napkins. Smiley face, steam pot, heart. She whispered into the empty room, "Where did they take you?" But silence has no answers, only echoes. There was no letter, no warning, no final conversation in a manager's office. Just a cold silence that spread like mold through the kitchen halls of Delphine. Grace returned the day after the pantry incident, as she always did, early, prepared, sleeves already rolled and hair tied back beneath her gray bandana. The locker room lights flickered. The stainless steel counters gleamed. She moved to her station with practiced precision. The others didn't look up. Even Marta, the prep cook she'd traded shift snacks with, barely nodded. Her eyes dropped back to the sink like they'd been trained to avoid Grace. By 5:40 p.m., a sense of unease had already thickened in her chest. At 6:10, a new sous chef, someone she didn't recognize, tapped her shoulder wordlessly and motioned toward the back corridor near the office. Grace followed. The office door was shut. Instead, the hallway turned quiet. No one came. She waited 13 minutes. She remembered because she counted every tick of the clock above the service board, her hands clenched to keep from shaking. Then her keycard wouldn't open the locker room door. Her name was no longer listed on the night shift roster. And no one said a word. That was how it ended. Not with accusation, not even with anger. Just absence. A calculated void. By morning, she received an email from HR. Polite, short. As of this date, your employment has been terminated due to internal policy violations regarding kitchen protocol and product management. Your final paycheck will be mailed. Thank you for your service. No mention of theft, but enough to stain. She took the bus home in silence. The winter morning outside bled pale and still. Frost crawled over bus windows like spider veins. She sat between a college kid with earbuds and a man in a construction vest holding yesterday's dreams in his hands. No one saw her. That, too, was part of the punishment. The first restaurant she applied to was Oliver's Bistro off Lombard Street. The owner scanned her resume, raised an eyebrow at the word Delphine, and said, "We'll call." They didn't. She tried the griddle spot downtown. The hostess glanced at her, then murmured, "We're full up." She hadn't even asked what positions were open. By the end of the week, she stopped writing her experience at Delphine on applications. By the end of the month, she stopped writing at all. Grace started cleaning floors in a hotel overnight. Not officially employed, she was a freelance contractor, hired under a third-party service that paid late and spoke in code. But it was quiet work. She liked the silence now. It matched her. At home, things were worse. Her mother's dialysis appointments grew more frequent, the coughing more violent. Some nights, Grace had to choose between refilling prescriptions and keeping the heat running. Still, she kept one ritual. Every Wednesday night, after her shift ended at 3 a.m., she would walk down to Patterson Park, wearing 2 coats and carrying a brown paper bag. Inside, half a sandwich, a pack of crackers, and a thermos of soup. She always left it on the same bench. Sometimes it was still there by morning. Other times it was gone. But there were no more notes, no more crayon hearts, no more little eyes watching from behind trees. She knew they were gone, but she kept coming anyway, because hope, once planted, does not uproot easily. A month later, while vacuuming the 12th floor of Whitmore Global's corporate office, she passed by a break room and heard laughter. 3 men in expensive suits stood around a glowing laptop. "Did you see this?" one said, chuckling. "They caught her on camera, taking food out of the cold prep without logging it. What an idiot!" Another leaned in. "Chef Whitmore himself installed those cams. Knew someone was bleeding product." Grace paused, just long enough to catch the final words. "She thought nobody was watching. Big mistake." The vacuum hummed against her hip. She didn't flinch, just kept walking. But inside, something splintered. Not because of the insult, because of his name. Charles Whitmore. She had always known he held power, but she hadn't realized how far his reach extended. He wasn't just head chef at Delphine. He sat on the board of its parent company, owned stakes in a dozen culinary groups. He was quoted in Forbes and featured in GQ for his relentless standards. He didn't need to accuse her publicly. All he had to do was plant the stain, and the industry would close its doors forever. A whisper from him was louder than any defense she could offer. She returned home that night with salt in her throat and steel in her chest. Her mother was asleep, her face thin and drawn beneath the covers. Grace sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope that held their overdue utility bill. Next to it lay a drawing, a crumpled old napkin she had once unfolded and smoothed flat. A little pot, with steam rising in curls. A gift from a child who'd once trusted her, who had since vanished. Grace pressed the napkin to her lips. And that was the night she decided they may have stolen her name, but not her memory. They could whisper behind doors, circulate lies, erase her from rosters, but they could not undo what had been done between her and those 2 children. Not every truth needs a courtroom. Some are carried in the quiet resilience of the wrongly accused. And one day, when the moment came, she would find a way to bring the truth back into the light. Baltimore at night had 2 faces. One belonged to the glimmer of neon lights along the harbor, where tourists laughed over cocktails and jazz trickled out of rooftop bars, an illusion of elegance. The other face was where Grace Miller lived. Her 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of McElderry Street was a box of still air and flaking paint. Each morning, the rattle of garbage trucks shook the windows. Each night, the hollow cough of her mother, Mabel, cut through the silence like a warning. Grace had long grown used to this, measuring out pills, timing dialysis appointments, boiling rice into porridge. Her mother would smile and say, "As long as you're here, baby, I still feel full." So Grace didn't fall apart. By day, she delivered groceries for a local corner store, At night, she mopped office floors and scrubbed bathrooms until dawn. And twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, no matter how tired she was, she made her way to Patterson Park. That's where she used to find the children. She didn't know their names. She never asked. But she remembered the boy, about 10, always standing guard. His eyes, alert and flinty, seemed to slice through shadows. And the girl, small, perhaps 7, with curls like tangled ivy and a gaze that silently asked, "Do I really deserve this?" Grace never answered. She simply left small offerings, a piece of chicken pie, a juice box, a single ripe banana, and every time by morning the food would be gone. Sometimes a crayon note would be left behind, drawn on the back of napkins. A crooked heart, a lopsided house, a little figure with wild hair beside someone tall with a bandana. She assumed that was her. She saved each one in a rusted tea tin in her kitchen drawer, as if they were letters from a world only she and 2 unnamed children shared. She didn't realize how much she needed them until they vanished. One freezing night, the rain came down like threads of ice. Grace showed up to the bench with a brown paper bag, fingers stiff, breath clouding the air. She placed the food down. No sound. No rustle behind the trees. No wide eyes peeking from beneath the bushes. Nothing. She waited. For an hour. No one came. The next night, she returned. Still nothing. The food sat untouched, cold and soggy with sleet. On the 3rd night, an old park attendant she'd occasionally greeted approached her, cigarette dangling between his fingers. "You looking for someone?" he asked. Grace kept her voice steady. "There were 2 kids. They used to come here. I left food for them." The man exhaled slowly. "Yeah. They're gone. Some call must have gone in. Social services came, picked him up." "Did they resist?" Grace asked, barely above a whisper. He shook his head. The boy just held her hand. Didn't speak, like he'd been through it before. Grace sat on the wet bench, rain soaking through her coat. She didn't cry. She just bent forward, her head in her hands, as if the weight of the world had finally collapsed on her back. The streets between her and those children suddenly stretched like cold, endless corridors, like the ones in hospitals lined with bad news. She returned home, lit the kitchen light, opened the tea tin. She laid out the crayon drawings across the table. A smiley face, a pot with steam, a heart. She traced the lines with trembling fingers and whispered 2 names that had lived only in her imagination. Jordan, Ava. Names she had given them in her heart, names to make the ache feel less hollow. That same week, her mother declined sharply. Mabel Miller could no longer eat solid food. Her skin turned papery, her eyes cloudy. One night she tugged Grace close and whispered, "Don't let your kindness be buried, baby. Not even if they don't see it. Not even if it gets you hurt. Use it to stand tall. Someone out there, someone's gonna remember. Someone's gonna survive. Because of you." Those were her last words. 3 days later, she passed quietly in a crowded ward at Johns Hopkins, surrounded by humming machines and cold linoleum. Grace held her hand long after her breath faded, and the only thing in her mind was the memory of a little girl hiding behind a spice rack. She walked home alone. She buried her mother, the children, and her own hope in the streets of Baltimore, streets where no one remembered her name, where kindness had once cost her everything. Still, every so often, Grace would return to Patterson Park. Not with food, not with expectation, just to sit, to listen, to whisper into the wind that someone had once mattered, and maybe still did. And in that silence, she searched not for the children, but for herself. The funeral was small. 3 rows of chairs, 1 photo, a closed casket. No flowers. Grace couldn't afford them. The hospice chaplain spoke softly about Mabel's strength, her resilience, her faith. But Grace barely heard it. She sat still, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the old, worn Bible her mother used to keep beside her pillow. It now rested on top of the casket like a quiet crown. After the service, no one lingered. Grief, in neighborhoods like theirs, was a private thing. A neighbor dropped off a casserole and left before she could say thank you. Someone from the dialysis center sent a sympathy card with the name spelled wrong. Grace tucked it into a drawer. That night, she found herself back at the kitchen table. The tin box was there. So were the napkins. So was the silence. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she opened her mother's Bible. The pages were soft from decades of turning. Notes were scribbled in the margins, some in pen, some in pencil, some in highlighter that had long since faded. Her fingers landed on a passage underlined 3 times in red ink. Do not grow weary in doing good, for at the proper time you will reap a harvest if you do not give up. Galatians chapter 6:9. Beneath it, in Mabel's shaky cursive, were 6 words. Kindness is never wasted, Grace. She touched the page, and finally she wept. Not the quiet, careful tears she allowed herself at night, but raw, full-bodied sobs that shook through her ribs and folded her over the Bible like a storm breaking inside her chest. She cried for her mother. She cried for the children. She cried for the life stolen from her by a lie no one ever questioned. And when the tears slowed, she whispered into the space her mother used to fill. I promise you, Mama, I won't let it end like this. That promise changed everything. The next morning, she woke up early, earlier than she had in months. She boiled water for coffee, cleaned the kitchen top to bottom, scrubbed the bathroom until it gleamed. Then she pulled out a notebook, not the kind for bills or grocery lists, the kind she used to write in when she still believed in a future. Page 1. A list of names. Every restaurant she'd ever applied to. Every place she'd been rejected. And then, Charles Whitmore. She circled his name 3 times. That afternoon, she returned to Whitmore Global, the towering glass building downtown where she worked nights as a contracted janitor. But this time, she didn't bring a mop. She brought a plan. It started with observation. She spent the next 2 weeks watching, quietly, methodically, tracking which floors were cleared at what hours, where executives kept their documents, which security guards took smoke breaks too long, and which printers were used the most. And then, one night, when the 11th floor was empty and the motion sensors reset, she slipped into a utility closet with nothing but gloves and a phone. There, tucked between a stack of old mops and a box of expired light bulbs, was an unlocked cabinet. Inside, loose folders, printouts, reports, careless, forgotten, but damning. She didn't take them. She photographed them. Every page. Email exchanges between senior staff with discriminatory comments. payroll inconsistencies, whispered mentions of off-the-books contracts in foreign accounts, and one recording, half corrupted, but clear enough. Charles Whitmore, in a board meeting, laughing, "Don't let them into the front house. They don't belong here." The "them" needed no clarification. Grace stared at the audio clip in her hands. Her pulse roared in her ears. She had the truth. She had his voice. And for the first time in years, the weight on her chest didn't feel like shame. It felt like power. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. So she did something harder than breaking silence. She asked for help. In a quiet diner on the edge of Midtown, she met Angela Green, a civil rights attorney with tired eyes and a fearless mouth. Angela had been fighting discrimination cases for 20 years. Grace placed the photos and recording on the table. Angela's eyes widened. "You got this yourself?" she asked. Grace nodded. "I don't want money. I want justice. Not just for me. For anyone he's crushed." Angela leaned back in her seat, staring at Grace like she was seeing something rare. "Miss Miller," she said softly, "most people with nothing are too afraid to speak." Grace's voice didn't waver. "I've already lost everything. What more can he take?" The two women shook hands. It was the first time in 18 years that Grace felt like someone believed her. And it wouldn't be the last. The air inside Whitmore Global's 11th floor always smelled sterile, like polished ambition and filtered lies. Grace had walked these hallways for nearly a year now, pushing a mop cart beneath flickering fluorescent lights, invisible to the men in suits whose shoes squeaked like authority. But ever since she made the promise to her mother, she no longer walked these halls as a ghost. She walked them like a witness. And tonight, she would become something more. The plan had taken weeks. She knew the schedules now, who left early on Thursdays, which guards slept through the night shift, which motion sensors could be reset with a wipe of industrial cleaner. She moved like a shadow, but this time she wanted to be seen, just not by the wrong people. Inside the custodial closet, hidden behind stacks of old supply boxes, was a dented beige file cabinet. One drawer stuck slightly. No one had touched it in years. A layer of dust coated the handle like it had been waiting for her hand. She reached in. Her fingers brushed against paper, folders, unfiled reports, printed memos, and one thick envelope labeled in sharp marker, "Legal hold, internal only." She paused. Listened. Silence. Then she pulled the envelope free and turned on her phone's camera. One by one, she photographed each page, pages that detailed off-book payments to shell companies, memos approving discriminatory hiring language, and internal notes on staff reassignments made to avoid optics of over-diversity. Her hands trembled only once, when she found a printed transcript of a boardroom meeting dated 3 months after she was fired from Delphine. At the bottom of page 2 was a quote attributed to Charles Whitmore. "Grace Miller? She was just another affirmative action favor. I let her in the kitchen and she fed strays like it was a soup kitchen. She got what she deserved." Grace froze. The breath caught in her chest like broken glass. Not just the cruelty of the words, but the coldness of their documentation. A file. A footnote. Her pain. Her shame. Her banishment. Filed away like a budget item. She took the photo anyway. She took them all. By the time she left the building that night, her phone's memory was full. So was her resolve. Angela Green sat across from her the next morning in a cramped legal aid office in the Bronx. The sun through the window turned the dust in the air into falling stars. Grace laid the printed photos down like cards in a deck no one wanted to see. Angela didn't speak at first. She just stared. One photo, then the next, and then the next. When she finally looked up, her voice was low but sharp. "This isn't just discrimination," she said. "This is racketeering, fraud, labor violation, racial targeting. You could bring down the whole house." Grace nodded. "I don't want revenge," she said. "I want the truth to matter again." Angela leaned forward, her fingers steepled under her chin. "Then we'll make it matter." The next weeks moved fast. Angela assembled a legal team. Quietly, carefully. They drafted letters to the IRS, to the Department of Labor, to the State Ethics Board. They contacted journalists who knew how to wait for the right moment to publish. And Grace? Grace kept working. Each night she mopped the very halls where her dignity had once been erased. Each morning she walked to the legal office with new files, new patterns, new names she remembered hearing whispered in conference rooms. The case was growing. So was the storm. Then came the breach. One Thursday evening, while Grace was cleaning a stairwell, a voice behind her said, "I always knew you'd crawl back." She turned. Charles Whitmore. Older now. Grayer. But his voice still sliced like the first nick of a chef's knife. "I see you're still cleaning up after people." Fitting. Grace didn't flinch. She didn't bow. She didn't even blink. She stood straight and said, "I'm not cleaning up after anyone, Mr. Whitmore. I'm preparing the floor for the truth." He laughed. "Truth?" he scoffed. "What truth? You were a nobody, Grace. You still are. No one's listening." She stepped forward. "Then why are you here, watching me?" His smile faltered, just for a second. And Grace saw it, the first crack in the empire. That night, she texted Angela just 4 words. "He knows I know." Angela replied instantly. "Then it's time." By dawn, the letters had gone out. The IRS, the media, the ethics board, each one with copies of the documents, each one bearing Grace's name, no longer hidden, no longer afraid, no longer cleaning up someone else's mess. She was burning the mask they had forced her to wear. And when the story broke, it would not just be about one woman's fall. It would be about a system built on silence, and the woman who finally chose to speak. Chapter 7. Collapse. Before the contract. The air in the Whitmore Global boardroom was charged with tension. Not the kind born of fear, but the giddy, dangerous kind born of power. On the 27th floor, under vaulted glass and marble ceilings, executives stood in tailored suits clutching champagne flutes. Journalists hovered near the back, notebooks in hand. In 30 minutes, Charles Whitmore would sign a $400 million investment agreement with a German equity firm, an international merger that would secure his legacy and elevate his name alongside titans of industry. A media team was already staging photo ops. A banner hung across the room. Whitmore Global plus Bravner Partnership launch. Everything looked perfect, except it wasn't. Grace Miller stood across the street, watching from inside a cafe with large bay windows. The press hadn't seen her. No one knew her face. To them, she was just a middle-aged woman in a gray coat stirring coffee that had long gone cold. But inside her coat pocket was her phone, and on that phone was the countdown. Angela's message had been clear. "We go live at 10:45 a.m. sharp. Wait for it." Grace's eyes flicked to the television above the cafe counter. It was tuned to a local station, currently covering weather and traffic delays. She checked the time. 10:44. She held her breath. 10:45. The screen flashed. Breaking news. The broadcast changed instantly. A new anchor appeared, serious, steady. This just in, investigative reports reveal multiple counts of financial misconduct, discriminatory hiring practices, and whistleblower suppression inside one of the region's largest corporations, Whitmore Global. The screen split into 4. Audio of Charles Whitmore mocking minority staff, photos of internal emails, charts showing secret payments, an image of a crayon drawing on a napkin. At the bottom, the headline scrolled, "Former janitor exposes systemic corruption at Whitmore Global. FBI responds." Grace closed her eyes for one breath, then turned and left the cafe. Inside the boardroom, chaos bloomed like fire in dry grass. Phones vibrated. Screens lit up. The German investors huddled in whispers, their legal counsel already scrolling through the headlines. One of them barked something in German. Another began packing his briefcase without a word. Charles Whitmore stood frozen, a pen in his hand halfway to the signature line, his jaw clenched. Then came the call, not from his assistant, not from PR, from the chairman of the board. He stepped out of the room, closed the door. He didn't return. The contract was never signed. 2 hours later, Whitmore Global's stock dropped 17%. By nightfall, the board released a statement. Effective immediately, Charles Whitmore has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. And underneath, in small print, "We acknowledge the courage of the whistleblower who brought these matters to light." In the legal office, Grace sat beside Angela, watching it unfold on a small desktop monitor. She said nothing, just stared. Angela leaned over, voice hushed. "You did it." Grace shook her head. "We did it." Angela smiled. "He underestimated you." "No," Grace replied, eyes still on the screen. "He underestimated what one truth can do when someone's finally ready to speak it out loud." Her phone vibrated again. This time, a text. Unknown number. "Do you remember us, Miss Grace?" Her heart stopped. She stared at the message. Then, another one came. Photo attached. She opened it. 2 adults. A man in a white chef's coat. A woman in a navy blazer. They were standing in front of a small food bank, and between them, a chalkboard with the words, "Every plate we serve exists because someone fed us first." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. Jordan and Ava. They had found her. Or maybe they had never stopped watching. That night, Grace didn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because she was awake with something new. hope. It had been 18 years since Grace Miller last saw their faces. 18 winters, 18 birthdays missed, 18 years of wondering if they remembered her at all. And now they stood in front of her, flesh and blood, no longer hungry shadows behind a pantry door, but full-grown, full-hearted, and filled with something deeper than memory: gratitude. They met in Brooklyn, in a quiet cafe that smelled like fresh bread and eucalyptus. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, painting soft gold over the wooden table where Grace sat with trembling hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She didn't know what to expect, but when the door opened, she knew, instantly. Jordan walked in first, tall, broad-shouldered, his chef's coat crisp, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his eyes, still sharp, still carrying that same fire, but now gentled by time and purpose. Ava followed close behind, composed, poised, in a navy blue suit that fit her like armor and grace stitched together, her hair in soft curls, her smile hesitant, almost shy. They saw her, and for a second, the world paused. Then Ava whispered, "Miss Grace?" Grace stood up too fast, her chair scraping the floor behind her. She couldn't speak. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Then Jordan stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, gently but fully, like someone holding something sacred. Ava followed, and in the quiet hum of the cafe, the three of them stood in a circle of healing, trembling, crying, laughing through tears. They sat for hours. Stories poured out like warm soup after a long storm. Ava had grown up in the foster system. She bounced through 3 homes before finally landing with a retired judge who noticed her gift for argument and her relentless sense of justice. She became a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. A civil rights attorney in D.C., known for her refusal to settle quietly. Jordan's path had been different. He'd run away from his first group home at 13, lived in shelters, worked in diners. But he'd always remembered the way Grace had plated food, not just feeding bodies, but offering dignity. At 19, he enrolled in a culinary program. Now, he ran a restaurant of his own. Reclaimed, a bistro dedicated to training and hiring formerly homeless youth. Grace listened, hands to her mouth, eyes brimming. "I didn't do anything special," she said softly. "I just gave you scraps." Ava shook her head. "You didn't give us scraps, Miss Grace. You gave us hope." Jordan added, "You didn't just feed us. You believed we were worth feeding. No one else did." Then Ava pulled out a folder. Not legal briefs, not paperwork, just sketches, notes, an idea. She laid it on the table. The Lighthouse Collective, a community non-profit, 3 branches. A restaurant with open hiring for youth aging out of foster care. A legal clinic for those facing discrimination or eviction. A workforce training center for women over 40, especially those with non-traditional work histories. Jordan tapped the page. "I'll run the kitchen." Ava pointed to the second. "I'll run the legal side." Then she slid the 3rd section toward Grace. "And we want you to run this." Grace blinked. "Me?" "You've lived it. You've walked through fire. No one will believe in these women more than you." Jordan smiled. "You were the first one who believed in us. Now let us build something that believes in others." Grace's hands trembled as she held the paper. The words blurred, not from age, but from tears. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out the window. Across the Brooklyn street, a little girl skipped rope beside her mother. The sunlight danced off the concrete like music. She thought of her mother, of the empty kitchen, the quiet hallway, the bench in Patterson Park. And she whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "Maybe I didn't lose them after all. Maybe they were just finding their way home." When she turned back to the table, she smiled, not with her lips, but with something deeper, something rooted. "Yes," she said, "let's build it." It started in an abandoned firehouse on the edge of Brooklyn. The bricks were weathered, ivy crawling up the back wall like time itself was trying to reclaim it. The windows were cracked. The floorboards groaned when you stepped too hard. But to Grace Miller, it looked like a lighthouse waiting to be lit. They cleaned it with their own hands, scrubbed grease off old walls, tore down drywall and rebuilt it with volunteers who had once stood in soup kitchen lines. Ava called in favors from pro bono architects. Jordan pulled in culinary students and carpenters from his restaurant. And Grace? She showed up every morning with a clipboard, a hammer, and the steadiness of someone who had already survived the worst. They painted the walls a warm gold, replaced shattered windows with recycled glass. On one of the walls in the foyer, they carved in a single sentence, "Dignity is a right, not a reward." The day they opened the Lighthouse Collective, the line outside stretched around the block. Not for charity, not for handouts, but for hope. Single mothers, formerly incarcerated men, young people aging out of foster care, women in their 50s holding wrinkled resumes, men with broken English and stronger hands than anyone in the room. They came, and they stayed. Jordan's kitchen opened first. Every day they served meals that were prepared with respect, plated like fine dining, but priced on a pay-what-you-can model. Diners sat next to each other without knowing who had paid full price and who had come in hungry with nothing to give. No receipts, no judgment, just nourishment. On the chalkboard at the entrance, it read, "If you're hungry, your family." Ava's legal clinic launched 2 weeks later. In a small room above the kitchen, she set up folding chairs and case files. Her first client was a woman being evicted without cause. Her second was a teenager who had been fired for wearing her natural hair. Her third, a Spanish-speaking grandmother denied citizenship after 25 years of working in a hotel laundry. She listened. She fought. She won. Grace's center opened last, and it was the one no one expected to matter most. She called it the Second Sunrise Room. It was a space filled with plants, soft chairs, bookshelves with worn covers, a wall lined with mirrors, not for vanity, but for women who hadn't looked themselves in the eye for years. Every woman who walked in was greeted by Grace herself, not with forms, but with a question. What did they tell you you're too old to do? Then she'd smile and say, "Let's prove them wrong." She brought in speakers, job trainers, retired nurses, and seamstresses. Women taught each other how to budget, how to interview, how to believe again. No one had titles, but everyone had a voice. And one afternoon, while Grace stood in the garden behind the firehouse, now turned into a community plot where basil and tomatoes grew beside tiny signs written by local kids, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But something told her to. The voice on the other end was low, shaken. "I saw you on television." She said nothing. I... I was wrong. Still nothing. Then came a sentence she never expected. I thought strength was in silence, but you proved it's in truth. It was Charles Whitmore. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't pretend. He just said, I'm watching your speech. The way people clap for you, it's how they used to clap for me. Grace looked out over the sunlit garden. She took a breath, then said gently, That applause was never for me. It's for the truth you tried to bury. It just kept growing. He hung up without another word, and Grace stood there, not with triumph, but with peace. That night, the lighthouse held its first community dinner. Candlelight flickered on long tables built by hand. The smell of fresh bread and slow-roasted vegetables filled the air. A local choir sang in three-part harmony. At the center of it all stood Grace, Jordan, and Ava, arms linked, eyes glistening. One woman approached Grace after dessert. She had tears in her eyes and a child holding her hand. I don't want charity, she said. I want a way forward. Grace knelt down, held the child's hand, and whispered, Then you're in the right place. And across the city, on the 27th floor of a now empty office, Charles Whitmore sat alone, watching the live stream. The applause was thunderous. But what broke him wasn't the clapping. It was Grace's final words on stage. We are not the leftovers of a broken system. We are the seeds, and we are growing. He set down his glass, and for the first time in his life, he wept not for his legacy, but for the lives he never lifted. The courtyard was alive with color. Marigolds bloomed between stepping stones. Tomato vines climbed trellises beside sunflowers nearly as tall as the fence. Children's chalk drawings sprawled across the pavement, smiling suns, rainbow houses, stick figures holding hands. Laughter rang in the air. And at the center of it all stood Grace Miller, holding a watering can in one hand and a stack of thank you letters in the other. It was opening day at the new vocational wing of the Lighthouse Collective. Behind her, the building stood tall, repainted in warm yellows and soft sage green. The sign above the entrance read, The Second Sunrise Center, for women who never gave up. The crowd was larger than anyone expected. Families, students, neighbors, reporters, local officials, even former clients who had once come in with nothing but fear. They were all here, not because of a fundraiser, not because of fame, but because they had seen what happened when kindness was watered long enough to bloom. Grace looked down at the letters in her hand, each one handwritten, creased from fingers that held them tightly. Some were misspelled, some were barely legible. But all of them began the same way. Thank you for seeing me. One letter came from a woman who, after losing her job at 58, had gone through the Lighthouse program and now ran her own catering company. Another was from a teenager whose mother had found legal help upstairs while she learned to sew downstairs. One letter was just a drawing, a little girl holding a shovel beside a plant. Grace smiled and wiped a tear with the edge of her sleeve. She turned to the podium, stepped up, and adjusted the microphone. The chatter quieted. The breeze stilled. She scanned the crowd until her eyes found Jordan, standing by the garden beds in his white apron, arms crossed, eyes soft. And Ava, on the steps, clipboard in hand, nodding, smiling, solid. Her family, built not by blood, but by choice. By survival. By love. Grace took a breath and began. I used to believe that dignity was something given, something handed down by people with power to those they deemed worthy. But I was wrong. Dignity lives inside us, all of us. Sometimes it just needs a place to be seen, to grow, to breathe. She paused. The wind rustled gently through the garden. There was a time I lost everything, she continued. My job, my name, my voice. But the world didn't end. Because even in the silence, someone remembered, and that memory became a seed, became a... She glanced at the chalk drawings, at the children running barefoot between the herbs, at the women leaning into each other like sisters. I don't stand here because I never fell. I stand here because someone once gave me something when I was starving. A napkin, a smile, a chance. And now we do the same. Not because it's charity, but because it's justice. Because, whoa, the world doesn't change when we speak louder. It changes when we listen deeper. Applause rose like the tide. Some people stood. Others wiped their eyes. A few hugged strangers beside them without even asking names. After the speeches, Grace wandered into the courtyard again. A little boy tugged on her coat. "Are you the lady who grows the food and the jobs?" Grace knelt down. "I help, but so do a lot of other people." He handed her a small paper envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "Seeds," he said proudly. "My mama says you know what to do with them." Grace opened the envelope. Inside, basil, sunflower, and a few mystery ones. She looked up at the boy, whose hair stood in soft coils and eyes sparkled with mischief. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded solemnly, like a farmer passing down a legacy. A reporter came up to her then, mic in hand. "Miss Miller, may I ask if you could say one thing to the man who once ruined your life? What would it be?" Grace looked past her, past the crowd, past the fences, then smiled. "I wouldn't say anything to him," she replied. The reporter blinked. "Nothing at all?" Grace shook her head gently. "I don't speak to ghosts." She turned, holding the envelope of seeds. "I speak to the ones still growing." The sun dipped lower in the sky. Children ran. Leaves fluttered. The world kept spinning. Imperfect, unfinished, but softer somehow. And in the heart of Brooklyn, behind an old firehouse that had once been forgotten, something new was taking root. Because forgiveness is not weakness. It is the greatest strength of the broken. The quiet power of those who choose, again and again, to rebuild the world with their bare hands.